Here's Jimbob to give some unconvincing rebuttals to the problem of evil.
In this episode, we take a look at the very popular atheist argument called the argument from evil, which is often claimed to be a defeater to God's very existence. Welcome to Arguments Against Atheism. I'm Jimbob. I'm here to give you the goods. So what is the argument from evil? I don't want to straw man it, so let's get it in precise form. The argument from evil goes as follows. Premise 1, God is omniscient, omnibenevolent, and omnipotent. Premise 2, an all-knowing, all-loving, and all-powerful God wouldn't permit suffering in the world. Premise 3, there is suffering in the world. Conclusion, God knows suffering will occur, so he either can't stop suffering, so he's not omnipotent, or he refuses to, so he's not omnibenevolent. Alrighty, did you see any obvious problems? I did. Premise 2 states an all-knowing, all-loving, and all-good God wouldn't permit suffering in the world.
The idea that suffering is bad is a strong intuition that people have, but it's not axiomatic. However, a lot of apologists argue that even atheists have a sense of morality because God has written morality on our hearts, causing needless suffering, and for any omnipotent being, all suffering is needless, because an all-powerful God would have the power to accomplish anything he wants without being reliant on anything, seems very much to be one of those things that, if there is a God, he has written onto our hearts. That's why people infer it to be the case. Certainly if God loves us, it's hard to imagine why he would impose unnecessary suffering upon us. How is that a loving thing to do? However, because it's not axiomatically true that suffering is evil, I wouldn't use this argument. Rather, I have a different argument. Premise 1, an omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent being would not do anything that said being declares to be evil. Premise 2, the Bible portrays God as doing things that he himself declares to be evil. Therefore, conclusion, the God portrayed in the Bible is either not omnipotent or not omniscient or not omnibenevolent. Isaiah 45:7 says that God creates evil. I think we can take it as axiomatic that a being which admits to creating evil is not omnibenevolent by definition. I've never heard a rebuttal to this argument that didn't involve some variety of hermeneutical contortionism aimed at convincing us that the Bible doesn't really mean what it plainly says. Typically, they say that the original Hebrew word is better translated as some other term, although the other terms they propose, like calamity or disaster, as better translations, all have equally pejorative connotations that don't really undermine my argument. It is still a contradiction to call an entity benevolent if that entity creates those things without needing to.
Well, why not? What's the contradiction? It seems this very low-level argument from personal incredulity has no basis. From a Christian view, long-suffering is actually a virtue. It is through suffering and sacrifice that we participate in the good. The overcoming of suffering is thematic in the Christian view and praxis. This premise also makes an assumption that suffering is evil. My question to the atheist is, what makes suffering evil?
Well, the intuition is more specifically that unnecessary suffering is evil. And again, for an all-powerful God, all suffering is unnecessary because an all-powerful God would have the power to achieve anything without suffering.
That depends on what you mean by evil.
Is having an infected tooth evil? Is a hurricane evil? What about a lion eating a baby zebra? Is that evil? These are all examples of things at most we find unpleasant. If I went to a restaurant and found the chicken special to be unpleasant, would it make sense to leave a review that stated, "Don't get the chicken. It was immoral"? No, that's silly. Preferences are preferences, not ethical stances.
Since I don't believe in objective morality, I don't understand what it would even mean for an ethical stance to not be a preference. Not all preferences are ethical stances, but all ethical stances are preferences. What separates ethical stances from other preferences is the effects those preferences have on other conscious beings. If you lived alone on a planet with no other conscious beings, none of your preferences would be ethical or unethical.
Now, a very similar position on morality was introduced and made popular by atheist Sam Harris in his book, The Moral Landscape. Sam's position was this. Morality is based on the maximization of sentient well-being. And I think we could all agree that suffering is bad. Well, no, Sam, we don't all agree.
I don't agree with Sam's position, but I think this is a straw man. Sam more often says that everyone agrees that the worst possible suffering for everyone is bad. Even if the overcoming of suffering is a good thing in the Christian view, the worst possible suffering would be suffering that could not be overcome. I doubt Jimbob believes that the worst possible suffering for everyone, which would even include God, would be good. But the reason I don't agree with Sam Harris is because I think there may very well be people who believe that if God commanded the worst possible suffering for everyone, then it would be good simply by virtue of the fact that he commanded it.
For one, you have to define suffering, as does the atheist who is using the argument from evil. Perhaps the atheist will say,
I think that it's fairly obvious that pain is the defining feature of what we call suffering.
well, that's not obvious. What's obvious is that we find pain unpleasant. We also find that human beings have the capacity to overcome pain.
Do people in hell have the capacity to overcome the pain they experience there? And why would creating suffering be necessary in the first place?
Keep in mind, there are people who are born without the ability to feel pain, and yet they arguably suffer more than those who can feel pain.
Why would an omnibenevolent God allow them to experience that suffering?
Well, I suppose we could redefine it and say that emotional and mental anguish would be the deciding factor in what is suffering.
Isn't emotional and mental hardship an essential feature of growth?
Insofar as that's true and a God exists, it is only true because God has made it that way. Why would it not be better to make hardship unnecessary for growth? I don't understand what it means for God to love us while making it essential that we suffer in order to grow.
Even from an evolutionary perspective, the cycles the human body endures are sometimes painful, but they're biological processes. Are they evil?
No, because evolution is not omnipotent and all-loving. This is the only way evolution has managed to disincentivize us from injuring ourselves. However, you believe that God imposed these pains. Why would he do that if he loves us? Does this all-powerful God lack the power to make us such that we can thrive without these experiences?
There is a larger problem for this view that was best articulated by William Lane Craig in his debate against Harris several years ago. If well-being is the basis for moral good, is it possible to obtain the peaks of well-being by causing harm? Well, yes, it's not only logically possible, but history demonstrates that groups of people can and have maximized their well-being by causing suffering to others.
Yeah, you can do that, but an all-powerful God would not need to do that. An all-powerful God would have the power to achieve the peaks of well-being without imposing or even allowing suffering. He doesn't, though. Why?
When the atheist says pain and suffering is bad, they are actually saying most people don't prefer to feel pain or suffering.
Well, it's deeper than that. I don't know what it would mean to love someone and allow them to feel suffering that I have the power to relieve, especially if I'm able to achieve any good for them without allowing that suffering. That's inconceivable to me. Of course, the fact that I can't conceive of it doesn't mean that it can't be the case, but it does mean that I'm incapable of believing that it's the case.
Most people don't prefer the taste of licorice either.
Licorice.
If the atheist is claiming that we ought to pursue our preferences, then I'm not sure what was wrong with Jeffrey Dahmer eating brain custard.
I'm not of the opinion that we objectively ought to do anything. There are actions like the one you mentioned that I can't tolerate. Whether I ought or ought not tolerate them is irrelevant.
He merely preferred it to Ben and Jerry's. Now, for the sake of the argument, what if we grant the atheist that evil exists in the world? If evil exists, this necessitates an absolute standard for good.
I don't believe that objective evil does exist, but the Bible claims that it does, and it claims that God not only allows it, but imposes it unnecessarily, while also claiming that God is omnibenevolent. You don't have to subscribe to any objective moral standard to point out the fact that this is a contradiction.
The moment the atheist says evil does in fact exist, beyond our opinions or our preferences, then they are also saying an absolute standard of good exists.
That's why I don't say that objective evil exists.
So, what is this good standard? We've already established that it's not maximum well-being, because the maximum well-being can be attained through causing suffering to others.
If a person attains well-being through causing others to suffer, especially when they have the power to attain it without imposing suffering, then what sense does it make to call that being benevolent at all, let alone omnibenevolent?
In conclusion, the problem of evil, or the argument from evil, quite easily reduces to a Reddit-level slogan. If God real, why bad thing happen? If God real, why not I get into art school? If God real, why come I need oxygen to live? If God real, why come I'm not God?
If God loves me, why does he make suffering essential to my growth when he's perfectly capable of making suffering not be essential to growth? Seems like an entirely sensible question to me. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.